this painting is yours, I'll marry you, the billionaire said mockingly to the poor janitor. Everyone around laughed non-stop, and the poor man was left feeling embarrassed. That woman was Victoria Lancaster. Victoria was born and raised in Manhattan, New York, surrounded by million-dollar collections, international travel, and exclusive dinners in private salons. The daughter of Richard Lancaster, owner of one of the largest art gallery chains in the United States, she learned from an early age to use art as status currency. At 29, Victoria already dominated the most exclusive auction rooms. She walked into any event as if she owned the place. She wore haute couture from Milan, rare jewels bought in London, and wore a French perfume that left an unmistakable trail. But there was something no one saw in the glossy magazines. Victoria was well aware of the shady origins of the family fortune. Rare works of art were disappearing from European museums and mysteriously reappearing in private collections managed by the Lancasters. During lunch with her father, Victoria once asked, with a knowing smile, "What if someone ever finds out?" Richard replied without looking up from his plate. "Honey, the art world is like a card game. Whoever holds the deck controls the game, and we hold all the cards," Victoria learned quickly. For her, morality was an optional accessory, like a necklace worn only when convenient. While Victoria reigned over millionaire cocktail parties, the life of Caleb Moore, the 34-year-old caretaker, was made of silence and fresh paint. The son of a war veteran and an art teacher, he grew up in Boston, Massachusetts. At 19, he lost his mother to cancer and, shortly after, saw his father sink into alcoholism. Without the money to continue at Rhode Island School of Design, he abandoned his dream of becoming a recognized artist. Fate led him to the job of janitor at the Whitmore Museum of Fine Arts. It wasn't the life he imagined, but at least it kept him close to what he loved most: art. He lived in a small room in the museum's basement. A narrow mattress, an old lamp, and a shelf of used books were all he had. Behind a rusty cabinet, he hid his treasure, a makeshift easel and worn paintbrushes. At night, he painted on recycled canvases, creating scenes that seemed to have a soul, but he never signed them. One day, the night security guard, James, found him painting and commented, "Why don't you ever put your name on this, Caleb? It's amazing." Caleb smiled, without taking his eyes off the screen. "Because, James, no one looks at a painting of a janitor. They look at whoever the world has already decided is worth looking at." The Whitmore. The museum was grand, with neoclassical columns, iron gates, and cold marble covering the floor. For Victoria, the museum was just another showcase for displaying power. For Caleb, it was a quiet sanctuary. They first met in the main hallway when Victoria was visiting the new sculpture wing. She noticed Caleb in his uniform and with a broom in his hand, and commented with a sneer, "It must be nice to work here, even if it's just to clean the floor." Caleb looked up, measured his words, and calmly replied, "The floor is part of the museum. If it's dirty, no one notices the works." She laughed as if it were a joke. From then on, the clash between two worlds began to germinate. The days passed calmly, and there was Caleb, crouched with a bucket of water and a rag, meticulously cleaning the Whitmore's shiny floors. Museum of Fine Arts. It was another winter morning in Boston, the cold wind beating against the large windows of the main atrium. But this was no ordinary day. A new exhibition, which had arrived the night before, was about to open. The pieces had been stored in the museum's basement until their final installation, and for Caleb, a quiet art lover, anxiety gnawed at him. As he wiped the cloth, he glanced discreetly at the large hallway leading to the exhibition hall. Staff came and went, carrying frames, adjusting lights, cleaning display cases. The smell of fresh paint and polished wood mingled with the curator's expensive perfume. James, the museum security guard, and Caleb's only friend, walked past him and gave him a slight smile. "Hey, have you seen one?" "One of the new pieces is, man, it's just like you." Caleb looked up. "My face, what?" James leaned against the broom he was holding. "I can't explain it. When I saw it, I thought, this is Caleb's doing. Go check it out before they open the doors." Curiosity burned within him. Leaving the bucket against the wall, he quickly wiped his hands on the cloth and walked down the hallway. The sound of footsteps echoed, and the yellowish light from the ceiling lamps cast long shadows on the walls. When he entered the main hall, he stopped. Dozens of collectors and influential people were admiring the painting. Journalists and photographers were filming articles for newspapers, and many buyers were around. In the center of a grey velvet wall, under a carefully directed light, hung a large painting almost 5 feet wide, a painting he knew as well as his own face. A golden field at dusk, sunflowers gently tilted as if whispering to one another, and heavy clouds tinged with lilac and orange. Each brushstroke was a memory, each color a piece of his soul. His heart raced. But how? He remembered perfectly leaving that canvas, leaning against a pile of broken frames, in the most forgotten corner of the basement. He had painted that work 2 years earlier, in the cold early mornings, with an old blanket draped over his shoulders and the smell of cheap coffee in the air. He had never shown it to anyone. As he tried to process, a female voice sounded behind him. "Beautiful, isn't she?" He turned. Victoria Lancaster stood there, impeccable in a red silk dress, stiletto heels, and a slightly wry smile on her lips. "It's more than beautiful. It's alive," she said, crossing her arms. "I just don't understand why it's not in the catalogue." Caleb took a deep breath and replied, almost in a whisper, "Because it's mine." Victoria blinked slowly, as if she didn't understand. "Your?" And with a huge laugh, he said, "If this painting is yours, I'll marry you." A few people around who were listening to the conversation also started laughing non-stop. "I painted it in the basement of the museum. Someone must have put it here by mistake when they organized the exhibition," said Caleb, trying to defend himself from the sarcasm. She laughed, a short, sharp sound. "You, the janitor? You expect me to believe that a man who spends his day scrubbing floors is the author of this work?" He kept his gaze steady. "My job is to clean, but my life is to paint. It's always been my dream." Victoria stepped forward, looking him up and down. "You know what your problem is. You talk as if the truth has value. But here, in my world, truth is what those in power say it is." Caleb felt a weight on his chest, but he didn't back down. "Or maybe that's why your world needs to change." For a moment, she was silent, studying him, but then, with a half smile, she pulled away. "If you're telling the truth, you'll have to prove it, and I don't usually lose." Caleb turned his eyes to the canvas. He knew that the painting displayed there was not just a work of art, and could be an opportunity for him to turn the tide. Journalists snapped photos, art critics murmured their opinions, champagne glasses clinked to the soft sounds of a string quartet. The painting, his painting, remained exposed under the central light, like an evening star. Victoria, realizing there was no signature on the screen, stepped forward so everyone around could hear. The sound of her stiletto heels against the marble floor echoed like a war announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, raising his voice with false sweetness, "this man here," he pointed at Caleb with an elegant but venomous gesture, "just told me he painted this work. I ask you, is that what the museum is hiring now? Artist caretakers?" Some chuckled. Others exchanged uncomfortable glances. Caleb felt the blood rush to his face. "I didn't say, Miss Lancaster. I said it, and it's the truth." Victoria let out a mocking laugh. "The truth? A man who spends his days scrubbing floors, changing light bulbs, and carrying trash, is the author of this work that has enchanted international critics." Seriously, he kept his gaze fixed on her, trying not to tremble. "Talent doesn't choose a profession, and this painting came from my hands." Victoria moved closer, invading his personal space, her expensive perfume enveloping him like an invisible threat. Or maybe it came from better hands, mine, for example. A murmur of astonishment ran through the room. Are you saying you painted it? Asked a curious reporter. Exactly, she replied without hesitation. But since I haven't signed it yet, this man thought he could take it for himself. A smart move. If I hadn't caught him. Caleb stepped forward, his voice cracking. That's a lie. That work was in the basement, along with others I stored. I never wanted to display anything without permission. Liar! Victoria snapped, her tone making some of the guests flinch. And don't you dare call me a thief, Caleb tried to explain, but she raised her hand, signaling one of the security guards. Call the police, now! The mood changed immediately. Some guests moved away. Others stayed to watch as if it were a spectacle. 2 police officers entered the room a few minutes later, impeccably uniformed and serious-looking. What's the matter here, Mrs. Lancaster? One of them asked. Victoria indicated Caleb with a cold gesture. This man tried to steal my work. I want him taken in for questioning. Caleb threw up his hands in despair. No, I swear it's mine. Look at the layers of paint, the style. I have other paintings just like it in the basement. As to see them. But Victoria was quicker. Of course he has others, probably all stolen. Do your job, officers. The officer looked at Caleb. Sir, gather your things. You are being held for investigation. Please, you're making a mistake. I've worked here for years. I didn't steal anything. His voice broke. The officers handcuffed him in front of everyone. Victoria watched the scene with a small, almost satisfied smile. Before he was led away, she leaned in and whispered in his ear, In my world, Caleb, the one who shouts the loudest is the one who knows the truth. And today, that person is me. He was dragged out the door, his wrists bound by cold handcuffs that dug into his skin. The dull thud of the officers' boots against the marble floor echoed through the hallway, mixed with the incessant clicking of photographers. Each flash illuminated Caleb's haggard face for a second, as if the entire world were recording and immortalizing his fall. Turn your faces this way, Caleb. Show me the little thief of the year, shouted a reporter with a mocking smile. He kept his eyes down, swallowing hard to keep his anger from overflowing. Behind him, in the center of the courtroom, on an easel protected by glass, the painting remained, now officially in Victoria's hands. With a slight, victorious smile, she adjusted her pearl necklace and turned to the press. Justice has been served. My job is now safe. Caleb paused for a moment, turning his head to take one last look at his work. The brush he had held with trembling hands through entire nights of creation was now just a dirty trophy in the hands of the woman who destroyed his life. As they dragged him to the police car, he tasted the bitter taste of helplessness. Outside, the rain began to fall, fine and cold, as if even the sky was mourning. Suddenly, the police car stopped in front of an old police station in the city center with peeling walls and a faded sign. The rain continued to fall, forming puddles on the asphalt. Caleb was pulled out, handcuffs clinking, and pushed into the building. At the counter, a man in a wrinkled suit and a cold stare was waiting for them. It was Deputy Frank Dillard, known for solving problems for those with money and influence. He gave a wry smile. Well, so this is the museum thief artist, he said, flipping through some papers without even looking at Caleb. I didn't steal anything. That's my work, Caleb protested, his voice breaking. I painted every detail, every color. It's my invisible signature there. Frank slammed the folder shut, leaning over the table. Do you know what your problem is, Caleb? You think truth and justice matter in this world, but the bosses are the ones who pay the most. One of the officers laughed. And guess what? Miss Victoria is one of the highest paying. Frank gestured, and Caleb was led into a cold cell lit only by a dim bulb. The walls were damp-stained, and a rusty smell permeated the air. Hours later, Frank appeared again, leaning against the bars. I've already scheduled a speedy trial for you, 2 days, and I'll give you some advice, artist. Don't expect miracles. The judge already knows the verdict. Caleb clenched his fists, feeling the weight of each word. Outside, Victoria was probably clinking glasses of champagne, celebrating a victory that hadn't even been officially declared yet. And there, alone, He realized that the fight to prove his innocence would be much dirtier and more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The day of the trial arrived. It was a gray day, with heavy clouds covering the Boston sky. The atmosphere in the courtroom was charged, as if even the air knew the decision was already written before Caleb even stepped foot in the room. He was escorted to the dock by 2 police officers. He wore an old suit, borrowed from a prisoner, the collar slightly askew. Opposite, Victoria Lancaster arrived in a crisp navy blue dress, high heels echoing on the marble floor, and a calculated smile that felt more like a cut. Around her, 3 lawyers in tailored suits and a row of relatives watched like those watching a show set to succeed. The judge, Howard Griggs, entered the room with slow steps, but a steady gaze. Everyone knew, though no one dared say it aloud, that he owed the Lancaster family long-standing favors. The prosecutor opened the case with rehearsed lines, describing Caleb as a resentful employee who stole a valuable work to prove his worth to the world. Victoria, called to the stand, maintained a calm but venomous tone. "The truth is simple, Your Honor. True artists don't sweep floors, Mr. Caleb. What he did was appropriate something that wasn't his. And to make matters worse, he tried to pass himself off as a creative genius. It's almost pathetic." Caleb stood up, asking to speak. "I didn't steal anything. This work was born from my hands, from my soul. It's in the brushstrokes, in the colors. Anyone who understands art will see. Please, Your Honor, don't take from me what is mine." The judge sighed, as if bored. "Mr. Caleb Moore, the evidence and Miss Lancaster's testimony are clear. This court finds you guilty of the crime of grand larceny of high-value property. I sentence you to 2 years in state prison." The hammer struck dry, cutting through the air. Caleb felt as if the floor had dropped away. Before he could react, the officers pulled him up by the arms. He looked to the back of the room and saw 2 museum employees removing his painting, carefully wrapped in bubble wrap and wood. Victoria watched the scene, slightly raising her glass of water, as if toasting his defeat. As he walked through the door, Caleb gave one last look, not at her, but at the painting. It was as if he were silently saying, "I'll come back for you." Outside, reporters shouted questions, flashbulbs blinded him, and the clang of handcuffs seemed to announce the end of everything. But deep down, in the most hidden place in his chest, something still pulsed, the art that touched his soul, and that would one day touch the entire world. Shortly after, the iron gate slammed shut behind Caleb Moore with a bang that seemed to seal not only his freedom, but also any immediate hope. The sound echoed through the narrow hallway, muffled by the smell of rust and cheap disinfectant. The correctional officer, a burly man named Sullivan, led him down a hallway lit by fluorescent lights that flickered intermittently. "Come on, artist. Here, you paint with ash and dust," he said with a wry half-smile. Caleb's cell was small and cold, with a metal bed and a thin mattress that felt more like folded cloth. On the wall, marks scratched by previous occupants told of days and nights of despair. His cellmate, Eddie Three-Teeth Malone, looked him up and down and let out a dry laugh. "First time, you won't last a week if you don't learn to keep to yourself." The first few days were a brutal shock. The food was bland, often cold. Sunlight only entered through a small opening high in the wall, through which Caleb could see a patch of sky, his only slice of freedom. The other inmates treated him with disdain, many believing the story Victoria had spread, that he was a thief who pretended to be an artist. "Hey, Monet of the handcuffs," an inmate named Rico mocked, passing in front of the cell. "What are you going to paint? A portrait of your defeat?" Another added, drawing laughter. But what tore him apart most were the nights. Lying there, staring at the stained ceiling, Caleb relived the moment of the trial. Victoria's words echoing like hammer blows. "Real artists don't sweep the floor, Mr. Caleb." These phrases repeated themselves until sleep, heavy and restless, carried him away to dreams where he still held a paintbrush in his hands and a studio of his own. Over time, to keep from going insane, Caleb began doodling. First, he used charcoal from burnt kitchen scraps to draw on the cardboard of supply boxes. Then he traded favors for crumpled pieces of paper until he had some worn pencils. His drawings were different, living portraits, full of light, made even in the dim light of the prison. Eddie, who had previously ignored him, began to observe. "You know more. You should show this to the people. Maybe they'll stop seeing you as trash." But not everyone wanted to see Caleb flourish. A guard named Hank Dwyer, who had connections with influential people outside the area, tore up one of his drawings in front of him. "Art doesn't fill the plate, Moore. You're just another number here." Caleb didn't answer. He simply tucked the torn piece into his pocket, as if keeping a promise. Inside, life was a constant test. He faced cold, humiliation, and loneliness. But in the silence of the cell, each line he drew was a reminder. He was still an artist, and no one could erase that. Winter had arrived, and the cold in prison seemed to seep into the bones. Caleb Moore had been behind bars for almost 7 months. Time had hardened his gaze, but it hadn't dimmed the spark in his fingers that yearned for a paintbrush. One grey morning, as he scribbled discreetly on the back of an old form, he heard the clang of keys. "More visitor," announced Officer Hank Dwyer, with his usual tone of contempt. Caleb frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. He was led into the living room, where a man of about 50, wearing a worn overcoat, a fedora, and a weary look was waiting for him. His eyes were those of someone who had seen too much: injustice, lies, and pain. "Caleb Moore?" the man asked, extending his hand. "It's me, Detective Samuel Hart." His voice was firm, but not arrogant. "I'm investigating the Lancaster family, especially Victoria." The name made Caleb lean back in his chair, tense. "And why are you here?" he asked suspiciously. Hart leaned forward. "Because I believe you're in the wrong place. And if I'm right, maybe you can help me take down some very powerful people." Caleb let out a bitter laugh. "Believing didn't bring me freedom, Detective." Hart placed a manila envelope on the table. "Inside is paper, pencils, charcoal, and some cheap paints. I want to see something of yours. I want to see if what they say is true, that you really are an artist." At first, Caleb wasn't keen, but Hart insisted. "Show me who you really are, Moore. If you're as good as they say, I promise to fight for you." Caleb spent the next hour drawing. What emerged from his pencil was a portrait of an old woman holding an umbrella, alone on a rainy street. Each line carried melancholy and beauty at the same time. Hart fell silent, analyzing. Then he spoke softly. "My God, you're not lying." The following week, Hart returned. And the week after that too. He carried pads of paper, second-hand paints, worn brushes. "It's going to take time and patience, but I'm going to help you get out of here, Moore." "And what's in it for you?" Caleb asked, looking him in the eye. The detective took a deep breath. 20 years ago, I arrested a man who swore he was innocent. Months later, I discovered he was telling the truth, but it was too late. I won't make that mistake again." Hart then introduced Caleb to a criminal lawyer, Elliot Barnes, his longtime friend. A thin man, always wearing a brown coat and a sharp gaze. He said, "Barnes will handle your defense, but it won't be easy. Proving your innocence against people like the Lancasters is practically a battle." Caleb nodded. "And how exactly can I help, Detective? I'm stuck." Hart smirked. "You'll find out in time, but when that time comes, I'm going to need you to be more than an artist. I'm going to need you to be brave." That night, lying in his cell, Caleb stared at the patch of sky through the small window. For the first time in months, he felt something other than the weight of injustice. It was fragile, but it was there. It was hope. Samuel Hart, silent work, gradually built a circle around the Lancasters. Documents, bank records, photos taken at illegal auctions, testimonies from restorers who'd been paid to erase original signatures from stolen works. Little by little, Victoria's boasted empire began to crack. One morning, Caleb was in the prison yard when Hart appeared, wearing that rare smile of satisfaction. More, it's time. Time for what? For their downfall. Search warrants have already been issued. The Lancaster mansion is being ransacked as we speak, and indeed it was. At the luxurious estate in Upper East outside, FBI agents burst in, breaking down golden gates. In the main hall, Victoria watched, her face red with rage, while her father, Richard Lancaster, yelled about trespassing and millionaire lawyers, but no one heard them. The initial inventory was shocking: 27 works of art stolen, some missing for over 40 years, transaction records with the names of international collectors linked to the black market, a safe with dollars, euros and gold bars valued in the tens of millions. The press made a spectacle of the case. Headlines featured photos of Victoria descending the mansion steps, escorted by agents, wearing sunglasses and her usual arrogant expression. Back at the prison, Hart visited Caleb again. They'll try to use every penny to get out. They've already hired a team of lawyers who charge an hourly rate you wouldn't make in 5 years as a janitor. And what about us? What do we have? Hart leaned in, lowering his voice. The truth. And an ace up their sleeve they don't see coming. Caleb frowned. What letter? You. The Lancasters were under house arrest until their trial, scheduled for 3 weeks later, and tension in the city was only rising. Galleries were closing their doors for fear of being associated with the family, and journalists were camping out in front of the Lancaster mansion looking for news. The 3 weeks flew by and the big day arrived. Southern District Courthouse was surrounded by cameras, journalists, and onlookers. Sensational headlines plastered the newsstands. The fall of the Lancasters, empire of art, or criminal organization. Inside the room, the atmosphere was tense. On the right, the Lancaster family occupied the front row. Richard, imposing and cool, as if he were merely in a business meeting. Victoria, impeccable in a perfectly tailored grey dress, wearing sunglasses to disguise the tension. And behind them, a team of 6 lawyers in tailored suits, each with briefcases bulging with documents. On the other side, Detective Samuel Hart and Attorney Elliot Barnes were preparing their strategy. Caleb Moore, still wearing his beige prison uniform, entered escorted by 2 officers. The handcuffs on his wrists jingled with each step, as if to remind everyone that, in the eyes of the law, he was still a convict. Some whispered, "What is this prisoner doing here?" "He's the caretaker of the Lancaster case." Victoria didn't miss the chance to give a sarcastic smile as Caleb passed in front of her. "This isn't where you belong, Caleb. A thief belongs in jail." He, unfazed, simply replied quietly, "The truth always finds its way, even if it takes time." Judge Harold Kent, known for his relentless stance against corruption, banged the gavel. "The court is now in session. Case number 5382. The State against Richard Lancaster, Victoria Lancaster, and Associates. Crimes of receiving stolen goods, money laundering, and illegal trade in works of art." Lancaster family's lead attorney, Gregory Hale, asked to question Caleb. He stood up with the confidence of someone who had won dozens of cases for millionaire clients. "Mr. Moore, why should a convicted felon be taken seriously? You've already been convicted of art theft. Not exactly a credible record." "I was convicted of a crime I didn't commit," Caleb replied firmly. "And I'm here to prove it." Gregory gave a condescending smile. "Convenient, but isn't it curious that only now, when the Lancaster family is facing charges, you're coming up with this innocent story? It's not curiosity, Mr. Hale. It's opportunity. Detective Samuel Hart found evidence that I could never have obtained alone, locked in a cell." Victoria interrupted, venom in her voice. "He's no artist." "Real artists don't sweep floors." The judge banged his gavel. "Mrs. Lancaster, one more word without being called upon, and you will be removed from the room." When it was Caleb's lawyer, Elliot Barnes's turn, he insisted that his client address the jury directly. Caleb took a deep breath, looked at each juror, and began, I spent 8 months of my life being called a thief, not because I stole, but because I had no power to prove I was telling the truth. I spent days cleaning a museum I loved, dreaming of seeing my works on the walls, and when one of them finally appeared up there, it was used against me. There is no greater pain for an artist than seeing their soul ripped from the canvas and sold like trash. But this isn't just about me, it's about dignity, about the right of every human being to be judged by the truth, not by the size of their bank account or their last name. Some jurors looked away, tears streaming down their faces. Victoria shifted in her seat, trying to appear indifferent. Then Samuel Hart asked to show the final evidence, a set of legally obtained recordings of Victoria negotiating the sale of Caleb's painting to a European collector. In the recording, she laughed and said it was easy to frame the janitor. Who would have believed a man who scrubs floors could paint something like that? The audio crashed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. The jury fell silent. Richard Lancaster, the patriarch, hung his head, and the defense attorneys seemed drained of any argument. The judge, with a grave expression, announced, "After reviewing the evidence and testimony, this court finds the defendants guilty of all charges. Mr. Caleb Moore is acquitted and will be released immediately." Hart placed his hand on Caleb's shoulder and said softly, "You're free, Moore. Justice has won." Caleb took one last look at Victoria. She avoided him, staring at the floor, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was breathing real air. The heavy gate of Rikers State Penitentiary Island opened with a metallic creak that sounded like the sound of freedom. The cold New York wind hit Caleb Moore's face, and for the first time in 8 months, he took a deep breath without smelling rust, disinfectant, and moldy walls. The sunlight, which had seemed distant behind the bars, now shone directly on his face. Detective Samuel Hart was waiting for him, leaning against a black sedan, hands in his pockets, a half smile on his face, ready to start over, more than ever. "But something's still missing," Caleb replied, a new glint in his eye. On the way back to Manhattan, as they crossed the bridge, Caleb explained, "It's not just about getting out of here. I need my painting back. It's the only part of me they couldn't destroy." Hart nodded. "I knew you'd say that. Your lawyer filed the lawsuit yesterday. The court authorized the return. The painting is evidence in the lawsuit. And since you're now the rightful owner, it goes back to you." The car stopped in front of an old building in Upper East Side, where the department's seized works were stored. A court official wearing white gloves brought out a long, flat box, carefully sealed. "Mr. Moore, here it is." Caleb opened the seal slowly, as if about to touch something sacred. When the cloth covering the painting fell away, there it was, his masterpiece. The vivid brushstrokes, the contrast between the golden sun and the grey of the buildings, the lone figure in the corner watching the city awaken. Every detail carried a piece of his soul. He ran his fingers over the frame, and silent tears rolled down his face. "You came home," he whispered. Hart leaned closer and spoke softly. "This painting isn't just paint and canvas, Caleb. It's proof that they tried to destroy you and failed." Caleb smiled, still emotional. "No, Hart. It's proof that I survived." The press surrounded the exit, microphones extended, flashbulbs exploding. "Mr. Moore, how does it feel to be found not guilty? What do you intend to do now?" He paused, holding the painting tightly. "I'm going back to painting, not for them, but for myself, and for everyone else who has ever had their voice silenced." Hart opened the car door for him. As he climbed in, Caleb looked out the window and saw the courthouse fading behind him. The weight he'd been carrying seemed to finally lift. "What are you going to do with your life now, Caleb? Where are you going?" Hart said as he drove. "I'm going back to the museum. At least there I have a bed to sleep in. I can paint my pictures and who knows, maybe some collector will want to invest in me," Caleb said confidently. The detective then said goodbye to Caleb. Caleb thanked him profusely for his help and said that Hart had saved his life. "Thank you so much, Samuel. You saved my life. I am eternally grateful." The detective just smiled and replied, "Thank you, Moore. You made me prove once again that the truth is always the right choice." The detective then left Caleb at the door of the museum and went on his way. As soon as he pushed open the heavy service door, he smelled the familiar scent of floor polish and heard a familiar sound, the brush of a broom on the floor. It was James, his former security guard colleague, a stocky man with a tired smile. Earl dropped his broom and ran to hug him. "Caleb! A boy, I knew it. I knew you didn't do any of that." Caleb smiled, still in disbelief. "Thanks, James. It was hell, but it's over. I'm ready to go back. I already talked to the principal before I left," and James took a deep breath, and his smile faded. "That's the problem, friend. At first, they said you'd come back, that everything was fine. But what?" Caleb asked, feeling a weight on his chest. The security guard looked around, as if afraid of being overheard. After Mr. Whitmore received a phone call from Victoria's father, everything changed. They said you weren't fit for the museum's image. Not fit. I was acquitted, James. The judge, the jury, everyone saw the truth. I know, Caleb. But here, the truths that matter are the ones the powerful tell. Silence hung in the hallway. Caleb clutched the wrapped painting to his chest, as if it were a shield against the reality. Did they even let me go into my room to get my things? Earl swallowed. I'm sorry, but they already put everything in the hallway. They said you should take it now. When Caleb turned the corner, he saw his belongings, clothes, brushes, books, and small canvases piled into black bags like trash. The door to the small room where he'd lived for years was locked with a new padlock. He knelt down, pulled a canvas from a bag, and ran his hand over it, trying to ignore the searing pain in his chest. James stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. If I could, Caleb, I would have done something, but they're in charge here. Caleb looked up, his eyes welling up. Don't worry, friend. They can take my job, but they won't take my art. That night, the rain was falling hard as Caleb walked down Lexington Avenue, carrying 2 canvases and a bag of clothes. He stopped under the awning of a closed diner, leaned against the wall, and let himself slide down to the cold ground. In the reflection of a puddle, he saw his tired face, marked by everything he had lost. Free, but still trapped, he murmured, feeling the entire city pass him by without noticing. He then spent the night under a canopy on 15th Street next to Walmart. The day dawned, the morning cool, and Caleb walked slowly down Madison Avenue, balancing 3 of his larger paintings under his arm, protected only by a worn cloth. His wet boots, the biting wind, and his empty stomach were already inseparable companions. He went from corner to corner, trying to sell his works to cafes, second-hand bookstores, and small shops. They all said the same thing. They're beautiful, but we don't have the budget for art right now. It was then, as he stopped in front of the window of an antique shop, that he heard firm footsteps approaching from behind. A deep, curious voice broke the silence. "Can I see one of them?" Caleb turned, a little suspicious, and saw a man in an impeccable grey suit, a navy scarf, and a look that blended warmth and critical analysis. He was about 60 years old, with slicked-back grey hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to commanding crowded rooms. The man removed the cloth covering one of the paintings. He stood still for a few seconds, taking in every detail of the painting, a cityscape at dawn, with vivid brushstrokes and subtle shadows. His eyes narrowed, and a slow smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "That line, I remember," he said, more to himself than to Caleb. Caleb frowned. "Remember what? The day you were humiliated in that museum. I was there. I saw you accused of theft. I saw the painting taken. And I saw the injustice that no one dared to stop." Caleb lowered his gaze. "And you didn't do anything either." The man sighed, a real weight in his voice. "And that's why I'm here now. I've spent months with this stuck in my mind. Right after I heard you'd been exonerated, I went to the museum to talk to you, but they said you'd disappeared. I went to police stations, tried to find someone who knew where you were, but nothing. And now I find you here in the middle of the street with your art in my arms." Caleb looked him in the eye, trying to figure out if it was pity or something bigger. "And why now? What do you want from me?" The man held out his hand. "My name is Richard Hale. I own Hale and Sons Art Gallery, one of the largest independent galleries on the East Coast. And I need to exhibit his work. I want the world to see what I saw in that painting. I want the name Caleb Moore to be on the right walls, in front of the right people." Caleb's heart raced. For a moment, the noise of the cars, the wind, and the pain of the past few years faded away. "Is this serious? I don't have money, or a studio, or I have all that, and more. I have space, connections, and the will to right a wrong I'm also part of. Let me do it." Caleb squeezed Richard's hand tightly, tears almost in his eyes. "So let's show the world," Richard smiled, patting him on the shoulder. "Fate has put us on the same street today, Caleb, and this time I'm not letting it go." In that moment, as they walked together toward a black car parked on the corner, Caleb felt the circle close. It wasn't just about art, it was about redemption. The months that followed were like a rebirth for Caleb Moore. Richard Hale lived up to every word he'd said at that Madison Avenue meeting. That same day, he took Caleb to a spacious Soho loft, which he'd converted into a private studio. The walls were covered with blank canvases, imported paints, new brushes, and natural light streamed in through the massive industrial windows. It was as if, for the first time, Caleb had a place that breathed his soul. "Here, Caleb, you're not a janitor. You're the artist you've always been," Richard said, handing him the keys. Caleb's first official exhibition took place 3 months later at Hale and Sons Art Gallery, with the imposing name in gold letters above the entrance, Caleb Moore, Lights and Shadows. On the night of the opening, influential art figures, collectors and journalists walked through the hall with glasses of sparkling wine, stopping in front of each work with expressions of amazement. Many couldn't believe this was the same man who, years earlier, had made headlines as the thieving janitor. A journalist approached, microphone in hand. "Mr. Moore, how is it possible to produce something so vibrant after everything you've been through?" Caleb smiled, looking at one of his most moving paintings, a depiction of a lonely man standing in the rain, holding a canvas to his chest. "Art is what's left when they try to take everything from you. It's what kept me alive." Every brush stroke he made now carried not only technique, but also a story of overcoming obstacles that touched everyone who listened. His paintings began to sell for sky-high prices, commissioned by international collectors. Within months, he went from being the ex-convict to the new golden name in American contemporary art. Uders and the painting that nearly destroyed her life, the one Victoria stole and sold, which was returned by court order, earned a place of honor in the gallery, with a plaque that read, "The work that resisted the lie." Caleb made a point of visiting poor neighborhoods, public schools, and community centers, bringing art to children who, like him, once had no access to anything. "If you have a dream, don't let anyone tell you you can't. I used to sweep the floors of a museum, and now my work is in them," he said, drawing applause and hope from the children. At the end of each day, as he closed his studio, Caleb looked out at the city skyline and took a deep breath. The pain, the humiliation, and the cold nights on the streets were still memories, but now they had become fuel. He didn't just rebuild his life, he painted it with the brightest colors ever. End of history.